So you have the judges sitting up here, and you usually have 3 judges, hence 1, 2, 3. The podium is located directly in front of the judges. You're not always going to have this set up. In smaller rooms, you might end up speaking from behind a desk. This is the ideal setup. Then you have the 2 teams. Let's say applicant sitting on one side.
That's respondent.
Fine, the applicant sitting on this side. No one really pays that much attention to it except for Kathy, clearly. The respondent sitting on this side. What's that?
Bailiff.
Bailiff. The bailiff has a task of keeping time. Admittedly, you would usually keep time yourself because you want to have a better idea where you are, and sometimes in the heat of the moment you may not see the bailiff. So it's handy to have some kind of a stopwatch, or usually, as is the case, the phone, provided you put it on airplane mode so it doesn't ring halfway through your submissions. How many people sitting on each side of applicant and respondent usually? 3. We keep talking about 2 or lists. So the third one is counsel. They could be your researcher. It doesn't matter if they're sitting on the side or sitting in the middle, that's kind of your decision. But you have applicant 1, the first person to speak. Applicant 1 has one of the most difficult tasks because they have to come at it cold. They don't know what the bench is like, and there is no warm-up, there is no time to get settled in. So they basically stand up and they start speaking. There are little tricks to how applicant 1 can improve their position. We'll come to that. After applicant 1 sits down, hands over to applicant 2. Seems obvious. In Jessup, you have 4 issues, as we keep talking about. Preferably 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we said that between applicant 1 and applicant 2, you divide it. So 2 of them goes to applicant 1, 2 of them goes to applicant 2, and they stand up and argue it. Depending on how the problem is set up, it may not be 1 and 2 and then 3 and 4. You might end up doing 1 and 4 or 1 and 3. So that's called how you split the press relief. Most teams just do 1, 2, 3, 4 because it's easier. But if you can understand the issues and you can see there's a close link between 2 of them, you might want to batch them up a little bit differently. Now, think back to what I said about doing research. I said the easiest way to do research is to split the 4 between the 4 of you. So one person does 1, both sides, one person does 2, both sides. Clearly that's not ideal for setting up to stand up and speak, because the person who, let's say applicant 1 did 1 both sides, and respondent 1 did 2 both sides. In that case, applicant 1 doesn't know anything about his second point, whereas the respondent knows nothing about his first point. Does that make sense? That is why at some point, preferably during the research stages, so usually after the first draft is completed, or sometimes right at the outset, instead of doing one person does 1 both sides, you would turn it around so that one person will be doing the stuff they will be speaking about. And that will enable them to research and understand. Anyone is confused, don't be. So you have then respondent 1, respondent 2. These are your 4 people. What I said was you have prayer for relief 1, prayer 2, prayer 3, prayer 4. Initially, applicant was doing prayer 1 both sides. At some point, they have to switch to do prayer 1 applicant and prayer 2 applicant. It's just pragmatic, because the more you research, the more you understand your position, and also the more convincing you can be when you're saying wholeheartedly that this is right, we are in the right, the other side is completely wrong. After the respondents speak, for those of you who have done it before, and hopefully everyone, would realize that there is something called the right of rebuttal. Rebuttal is a tricky area. The reason for rebuttal is because after the applicants sit down, they get to listen to the respondents for a long time. There is anything that can be said by the respondent, including applicants murdered their own mother. Now, that's not ideal. You need to stand up and challenge that. That's where rebuttal comes in. To challenge something that the respondent said that you completely disagree with. That's why the respondent also get a chance to respond to what you have said. So a surrebuttal is a response to the rebuttal, nothing more. Between you, the applicants effectively are speaking 1, 2, 3 times. You're allocated 45 minutes to do with as you please. Almost. Respondents equally speak 3 times. They're also given 45 minutes. How you split the 45 minutes is up to you, but you need to make a decision in advance. Now, usually, you would have a minimum of 20 minutes per speaker. I think there is a minimum requirement of 15 minutes per speaker according to the rules. But I could be wrong on the exact amount. But you would never have a speaker speaking less than 20 minutes. So if you have your 2 audience speaking for 20 minutes each, you have 5 minutes left for a rebuttal. 5 minutes is too much for a rebuttal. You would ordinarily allocate somewhere between 2 to 3 minutes for a rebuttal. That means you have an extra 2 to 3 minutes. So if you're having, let's say, 2 minutes, you now have 43 minutes to split. You can, depending on 2 factors, you decide who gets to speak more and how much more. 1, which issue is the big one? Who's going to run out of time? 2, depending on your speech and your style. If you're a slow speaker, you might need a bit more time. If you're a very good speaker, you might want the judges to remember that person a little bit more. So let's say applicant 1 gets 21 minutes. Applicant 2 gets 22 minutes. Just as a random number. The respondents equally have 45 minutes. Again, for surrebuttal, you allocate between 1 to 2 minutes for surrebuttal. Let's say, again, 2 minutes. So I don't know if you realized it's 2 to 3 here, 1 to 2 here. Primarily because if you are responding to the applicant, there is not much you can possibly say if you just respond to the rebuttal. And the same with the split up here. Now, this is a tricky area I said we'll come back to later. Let's start with applicant 1. First thing applicant 1 has to do is introduce himself, introduce his team, his co-agent. We mentioned this, that you're effectively an agent of the state. The person who's speaking is your co-agent. So you stand up, you introduce yourself, you introduce your co-agent. You would also tell the court exactly how long each of you will be speaking for. You will tell them what you will be speaking about. I will be dealing with prayers for relief 1 and 2, relating to yada 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 and yada yada yada. My co-agent, Mr. Bond, will deal with prayers for relief 3 and 4, namely whatever it may be. We each take 21 minutes and 22 minutes respectively, and we reserve 3 minutes for rebuttal. The reason I can just say that off the top of my head is because I've had to listen to it so many times and I've had to do it, and teach others to do it. So, you then as first applicant have to do something strange, because first respondent has to do exactly that as well. First applicant, however, has to offer the bench a brief summary of the facts. 95% of the judges will say, don't worry about it, move on. But you will have that 5% of annoying judges who will say, yes, please, give me a brief summary of the facts. Is, so far as possible, and this applies not just here, but all the way throughout, avoid giving the judges a choice. Don't ask them a question. You ask them a question, they will answer. So instead of saying, would your excellencies like a brief summary of the facts? And then you have to stand there and wait for them to say yes, no. You say, unless I can assist your excellencies with a brief summary of the facts, I will now move on. That's it, you've moved on. Now he has to interrupt you. That's one of the little tactics, because people are more reluctant to interrupt you compared to when they have to answer you. So you automatically have moved on. I'm already using terminology without realizing that the judges, you're supposed to use the terminology used in the ICJ. The judges are referred to as your excellencies. It's a bit of a power trip, your excellency. The judge in the middle is the president of the bench. Mr. President, Madam President. When you address them, collectively, they are your excellencies. If you address them as individual by name, your excellency blah, or Mr. President blah. So, we now have the judges, we have the two agents for each side. Each person stands up, goes to the podium in their turn. When the first applicant wants to speak, I'll do the formalities first and then I'll move on to the substance. At the end of their speech, they have to hand over to their co-agent. So you have a nice little summary at the end. This is just a formality of, unless I can assist your excellencies further, I will now pass to my co-agent, whoever it may be, Mr. Bond, to carry on with the submissions for the applicant. Sits down, second applicant stands up, does the same thing. Introduces himself, what he's going to talk about. Once he finishes, those conclude our main submissions. Unless I can help your excellencies further, I will now go and sit down. The respondent stands up, similar process. I keep saying I'm going to come back to this. For the formalities of this, I'm going to come back to at the end as well, because again, there are some little nuances. Substantively, the applicant have a fantastic position because they are setting the scene. They decide what is going to be argued. Now, you've done a fantastically researched memorial that you have written up. Now, your applicants will pick the best arguments from that. Your memorials are already the best arguments, but you're supposed to include the best of the best arguments. And you know, I mentioned there is a little tree diagram you draw which helps with your oral submissions. That is exactly what ideally each person will have in front of them. A little tree diagram. It's not in front of you, it's got to be in your head. You have, as first applicant, on issue 1, you have 3 main submissions. So this is issue A. Applicant 1, issue 1, or prayer for relief 1. When you stand up, I will be dealing with this and this. Under prayer for relief 1, we have 3 submissions to make. First, this. Second, this. Third, this. You just give the headline. This is called flagging. It's one of the most important things. If there are two things which are fantastically important, number one is your structure or flagging. So the judge knows where you're going with it. Because they can get lost. So you have, on the prayer for relief one, you have 3 submissions to make. You announce them. Moving on to our first submission. Again, clearly states the fact that you are now here. Under this submission, we make 2 propositions or 2 points. These are your sub-issues. First, this. Second, this. Some people like to also flag these. So when you say on the first submission, we make 2 points. First and second, and then move on. Moving on to my first point. That might be a little bit of an overkill in terms of flagging, but you can never underestimate the confusion of the judges. I don't want to call it stupidity, I don't want to call it age, hence much lower. But if you do it, not the end of the world. If you don't do it, equally fine. Moving on to my second submission. And then whatever points you may want to make under that. And then finally moving on to my third submission. Once this is done, you now have to move on to issue 2. Before you move on to issue 2, you conclude. A 1-line conclusion is more than enough. For those reasons, we should win on prayer for relief 1. And then you say, unless I can assist your excellencies further, I will now move on to my second prayer for relief. And then you start the process again. You flag the submissions on the second prayer for relief. Then you move on to the first submission on the second prayer for relief. Does everyone so far follow me? So it is very much a methodical structure. That doesn't happen in practice because the judges will never let you follow this beautiful structure that you have in your head. They will make you move around it. Sometimes they say, you stand up to speak. I will now move on to the first prayer for relief. No, we want to hear the second prayer for relief. Oh crap. Jump down here. Gather your thoughts. Sometimes equally within this, they will ask you questions which relates here. You need to have little nice ways of moving around submission. You cannot ever tell the judge, I'll come back to that. Or, please stop asking me questions because I have a nice structure. I will cover everything you could possibly want. Just stay quiet. No. If the judge wants you to do something, you will do it within reason. So, when the judge asks you a question which takes you down here, Your Excellency, that takes me to my third submission. You announce it. By announcing that you moved on to your third submission, you've told the judge exactly where you are within your structure. You answer his question, moving back to my first submission. You announce it, that I am being fluid by saying, fine, I'll answer this, I'll carry on for even 5 minutes on the third submission, I might even finish the entirety of the third submission. But then I will have the flexibility to move back to where I was, and I'm not going to lose track of where I was. That's why structure is so important. The second thing the judges will do, under submission 1, usually what you have is submission 1 is 1, 2, and 3. At least 2 of them are going to be complementary. You need to prove both to win. Your third submission is usually your alternative. You don't need to prove it, or not usually, but quite often. But it helps because it's an alternative argument that you have. So, might be a weaker argument. That's why it's your alternative. That's why it's not your main argument. The judges know this. They don't let you speak often for your strongest arguments. They want to hear how you cope with your weakest arguments. Not every judge, but the ones who are able. So they will move you to your weakest argument. It is expected that that is your weaker argument, so don't worry too much. The judge knows it, you know it, so long as you can cope with it, it's fine. Sometimes it doesn't even hurt if they move you to your third backup argument because they just want to see how much you know. At some point you can just almost give a smile to say, well, Your Excellency, this is our third alternative. To say, if they say, well, that's not very convincing, well, Your Excellency, this is my third alternative argument. Effectively, come on, you know it's going to be a crap argument. I know it's going to be a crap argument. Let's just move on with it. You can get away with things like that, so long as you maintain that facade of formality. So, you finish issue 1, do a little conclusion. You finish issue 2, you do a little conclusion. You finish both of them, you can even do an overall conclusion, provided you have time. There are a number of things that, when it comes to, I mentioned the points that for written submissions they look for. Technically speaking, the oral submissions are broken down into question and answers, knowledge of facts, style, poise and demeanor. Time management will come to at the end. All of this is your main weapon. And I say structure is the most important thing. The second most important thing is answering questions. You will get sometimes a barrage bombarded with questions. It is the ability to deal with those questions that will separate the good teams from the excellent teams. Everyone can have submissions, they can stand up and read it. It's how you deal with questions that is ideal. In order to have both a good structure and good ability to answer questions, you should not read. It's fine to have prepared speeches, but you should never stand up there and religiously start reading. Your Excellency, we make 2 submissions. First, with regards to blah. No. Papers should be there just for reference. There's always a debate, do I take papers up with me, do I not take papers up with me? I always said, if you don't take papers up with you, you are perhaps a little bit too arrogant, and I will make you quote something. I will say, give me the specific quote. Where does it, in paragraph 26 was it, of this case says this? What does it actually say? Now, good luck if you've managed to memorize paragraph 26 of this random case that I picked up. If you don't know it, then I'll say, well, how can we trust what you say? So, long story short, as much as some people like it, it is not truly the role of a lawyer not to have papers. Papers are there for reference. You will have, at the very least, 3 things with you up there. You will have an idea of the structure of your submissions. You will have your compromise, and you will have whatever main materials you may have to rely on. Whatever specific case parts you might want to take with you, whatever treaties you might want to take with you, so that you can potentially quote it back if needed. Ideally, in order to be able to do that, have a nice little folder. So you have compromise at the start, you flick it open, you have various references, and as you speak, you can flip over to the next piece. A nice little organized folder will make your life easier. Admittedly, especially not everyone does it, and you don't have to do it, but it's useful. So, how do you prepare? Oddly enough, one of the best ways to prepare is to write a script. It will give you that initial confidence. Doesn't work for everyone. For me, I always like to have my headline structure, for example, so I know where I'm going with it. For some people, no. They would rather actually write it down once, speak it out, And then, as much as they're never going to use it, some of those key phrases that they have so carefully selected does end up getting used quite often. Okay, little things. You have two things going for you when you're up there. You have your voice and you have your appearance. Make sure you are dressed for it. Usually, for ladies and gents, suits. Men should always wear a tie. If you want to be fantastically pompous, wear a bow tie. Ladies, skirt or trousers with jacket or blouse. Nothing which is, I used to follow my own coach's rule saying no pink. The only time pink is acceptable is if it is somewhere hidden. Like your socks can be pink if you want. But nothing that will attract the attention. You want the attention to be solely on what you're saying rather than something funky that you're wearing. When you stand up there, you want to appear as an agent of the state. It's meant to be quite serious. As much as you need to be having fun with it, you need to at least pretend like it is all very serious. Make eye contact. Engage the judges. People like to be looked at in the eyes. Scan the room. If you have one judge who is just staring at you non-stop, who's asking you all the questions, you don't want to be addressing all the questions back to him. You want to look at the other judges as well. So, as the other guys ask the question, this is how you would constantly be scanning the room and answering them. The tone of your voice. Make sure you can grab people's attention. You don't want to be shouting because that will become uncomfortable, especially if it's a small room. So know where you are going to be speaking. It's a small room. If you have a loud voice, try to tone it down a little. But try to avoid what is referred to as being monosyllabic. Less politely known as droning. Puts people to sleep. You want to occasionally just go, well, Your Excellencies, there are 2 points here. First, by just going up and down a little, not to that extreme, I hope, but you will grab people's attention. Your body language is important. You don't want to have the erratic hand movement. So if you're going to be stuck, hands on your podium and stand straight so that you would avoid running around like I am doing right now. Some people hand behind your back. Don't lean on one side because whatever you do which might not appear too distracting to you will be very distracting to the judge. Don't have jewelry that is going to be hammering on against the table as you speak. Don't have erratic movements. Don't play with your hair. I don't have that problem, thankfully, but occasionally it's fine to have hand gestures. So if you're planting your hand and you're speaking, at some point, if you want to, that is precisely the point, Your Excellency, or there are 3 points to make. With things like that, you can actually grab their attention because you have the infrequent hand movement. But if your hands are all over the place, suddenly you become a joke. Not ideal if you're trying to make a serious point. And especially since with most competitions, especially when involving human rights, you will have 2 sides. You will have the state, who is a heartless machine trying to make progress. And you have these poor little indigenous people, as is the case for your country this year, who have been trampled and who have been wronged. So, as the state, you want to be sympathetic. If you're making erratic movements and being very cold, that is the law. Doesn't help. You want to be sympathetic. So again, with your tone of voice and with your mannerisms, you can appear sympathetic. It doesn't have to be true. Your Excellencies, whilst we understand and we are saddened by the plight of these indigenous people, however, the majority have spoken. The law says this, whatever it may be. But that little tone of voice is, again, what distinguishes you from an average speaker. I know you guys are not native English speakers. Don't worry. No one cares. In fact, having an accent often means that the more stupid judges will give you extra points for no good reason, just because you're speaking in a second language. So it's not always a bad thing. I know people who actually studied in the UK, but happen to be of a different background or ethnicity. And when they speak in Jessup, they actually make sure that accent comes through even more strongly than when they normally speak. Just so that people would give them the benefit of doubt and give them a few extra points. If you mispronounce words, doesn't matter. If you can't quite think of a word, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, if you can make yourself understood, that's all that matters. And even if you forget a word, you will have these fantastically eager judges. You can have a little giggle about the fact that you can't quite remember the word, so you use an informal word. And they will like it because you've suddenly become very personable. Are effectively two ways of looking at it. One is, as much as it's all a role play, so you have to pretend like you're the agent and this is your submissions and this is what you're doing. You want to be liked. So being friendly with the bench is always a good thing. If the bench warms up to you, they will give you less of a hard time. And regardless if it is a round that you're always going to win, or if it is whatever it may be, you will get extra points just because they like you. It's human nature. So you want to be liked. That's why you always stand up. First thing you do, you smile. You look at the judges, you smile. If it is not in your nature to be too smiley, have it at the top of your paper, at the start. Smile. You laugh, but I actually used to coach someone who was very much prone to smiling. Didn't smile at all. And he had it at the top of his paper, so he would stand up and go, yes. And then the smile would disappear until he would move on to his second submission. Second prayer for relief. And then at the top of his page for the second prayer for relief, he also had smile. Moving on to my second prayer for relief. And then at the end for his conclusion, when he's sitting down. Unless I can assist you against his further. If you have to do it that way, do it that way. It works. The second potential issue is, and I don't know how many of you might fall into this trap, when people speak, they often speed up. You might want to have to slow down, and that's the second piece that people often write on the top of their pages. Smile, slow down. The second way of looking at it, so one is being nice and friendly and personable. The second way of looking at it is you want to dominate. You want to control. The best way to control is by not giving the judges any scope for asking. So we already mentioned one of them. You don't ask them a question. You don't say, can I move on? You say, unless your Excellency have any further questions, I will now move on. You automatically put the onus on yourself rather than the judge to say, yes, move on. Or, no, now that you asked me the question, I'm going to keep you on this for 5 minutes. Similarly, you answer the questions head on. If the judge is asking questions, you don't give them time to think of their next question. When the question comes in, your answer will always be, so far as possible, either a yes or a no. Yes, Your Excellency, however. No, Your Excellency, because. We used to have a saying, I have said this to so many people, unless you're a Brit or unless you're very much a fan of British TV, it would be lost. Has anyone here seen Little Britain? Okay, God. You have. Vicky Pollard. Yeah, but no, but. She always speaks in yeah, but no, but yeah, but no, but. The whole idea is you'll always start your answers with a yes or a no. Sometimes the answer is not that clear cut. It's okay to say yes and no, Your Excellencies, with a little smile. Yes and no, Your Excellencies. Well, what do you mean yes and no? Well, yes because of this, no because of this. Don't overdo things like that, because the aim is of the yes and no answers is more about shutting down the judge than about being liked. So, now that we know all of these, I will come back and emphasize 2 points. Structure. Have a clear structure. 2, answer questions. Again, if you're reading, you can't answer questions. You want to be able to look the guy in the face and answer his questions. Best example I can possibly give you is an oralist stood up, started speaking, the judge goes, I don't care what you have to say, I just want you to answer my questions. Oralist just went, closest border, pull away, as you oblige, Your Excellency. I'm hearing this first. That's it. By just doing that, provided he also knew what he was talking about and he could answer the questions, there was no way he was going to lose a round. So, make sure you have those 2 things in your head. We keep talking about the 2 oralists. Don't forget, you do have a 3rd person at the bench as well, your counsel. What happens here as you're speaking is the most important piece. What happens here, however, is also important, because when the first applicant is speaking, the second applicant, as well as the respondents, will get an idea of what the bench is like. You get 2 types of benches. You get what they call a cold bench. That is a bench that doesn't ask questions. And you get a hot bench. A bench that asks too many questions. You're more likely to see a hot bench than a cold bench. But you need to be prepared for both. So, as the first applicant who has no idea what the bench is going to be like is speaking, the other people are listening. They're getting ready. They are understanding what the bench is like, what they dislike. If you have a cold bench, you need to drag your points out. You need to go into your alternative arguments. You need to expand on them. You need to bring up every piece of law you know. Because speaking for 20 minutes when no one is asking you a question is a difficult task. Equally, if you have a hot bench, you then need to drop arguments. You change it. You don't necessarily, so you might have stood up and said, I have 3 submissions to make, but this one is your alternative. And then you see you have an incredibly hot bench. At some point, which is where a smart oralist will kick in, you finish your second point and you will just move on to your second submission, second prayer for leave. You completely avoid talking about your 3rd submission. Most benches don't even realize what just happened. It's fine, you decided not to argue it because you're running out of time. The other thing, what happens at the bench? When the applicants are speaking, the respondents are listening. They're writing things down because the respondent's role is, as the name suggests, to respond. The applicants pick the battlefield. They pick the issues that are going to be discussed. They pick the arguments. The respondent then has to respond to those arguments. The applicant is talking about, to use the Red Riding Hood example, admissibility. then you have to answer on admissibility. If they decide not to argue admissibility at all, then you don't have a choice but not to argue admissibility. Unless it is you who is on the front foot. Then if that makes sense to everyone. So if it's, for example, a jurisdiction challenge, which the respondent has to raise, of course the applicant isn't going to answer a jurisdiction challenge before it's been raised. But then when the respondent stands up, they can still raise a jurisdiction challenge. It's one of those oddities that happens in moot court competition, unfortunately. So your two respondent oralists will then have to prepare how they're going to approach responding to what the applicant has set out. It is possibly a good time to now talk about rebuttal and surrebuttal. Before I do that, as a matter of habit, if you're sitting at the bench, whether you are an agent who is about to stand up, whether you are an agent who has finished speaking, or whether you're off counsel, doesn't matter. The bench is supposed to, your table is supposed to be quiet. You don't talk. You don't, so far as possible, even whisper. You will pass notes across discreetly. The occasional whisper is fine, but you don't want it to be attracting the judge's attention. If you're sitting as an applicant and the respondent says something ludicrous, "Your Excellencies, I was just speaking to the applicant and he admitted murdering his own mother." You don't suddenly go, none of that. Poker face. Again, I don't know if the expression is poker face means you just don't show any emotion. Just sit there. At most you can't write a little note. And that's it. So you're not supposed to be doing or saying anything that will distract the judges. When one of your people is at the podium, you don't give them anything. No passing papers. No bending over to whisper something. The only time it is okay to give the person at the podium something, which should never happen, is if he forgot or she forgot to take something with them. If, for example, they forgot to take the compromis with them, then you would turn around and say, "Your Excellencies, I've left my copy of the compromis at the table. May I approach to pick it up?" And the judge will say yes, and then you can turn around and pick it up. But without the judge's permission, there is no interaction between the person at the podium and the table. This is, again, one of those things that doesn't happen in real life. In real practice, the person speaking will always be speaking to the people at the table because they have reams and reams of paperwork and research. So now, rebuttal and surrebuttal. They can be fantastically important if it's a close competition. And you can, as much as you have just spent 43 minutes speaking, you can win or lose a moot on the rebuttal and surrebuttal. I have said 2 to 3 minutes for rebuttal and 1 to 2 minutes for surrebuttal. The aim is a killer blow. Applicant, again, has a great position because they get to pick what points are going to be heard. You will pick somewhere between 2 to 3 points. In extreme scenarios, you may be able to just pick 1 or 4. 4 should be far, far less likely than even 1. You would always try to keep to 2 or 3. A one single, as they call it, assassination bullet can work if it's an incredibly close competition. But if you pick 10 points in rebuttal, that's it. There is no way you're going to be able to say them all. There's no way anyone's going to listen to them all. And worse yet, the respondent can stand up and answer however many of them they wish without necessarily answering them. But if you pick 2 points which are incredibly pertinent, things that the respondent just got wrong, then that is your killer blow. you want to pick two things which are, one, important. It has to be crucial to the case. And two, something that is just wrong. You can prepare rebuttal in advance. You know what the respondent submissions are going to be like. Sometimes they have no choice but to argue weak arguments. A good rebuttal will involve you looking impressive. You will stand up and say 2 points in rebuttal. First, the respondents state this. However, this is not the case and it has been proven by, and then you cite a ton of law. So you get the council resolution blah, General Assembly resolution blah. In the case of blah and blah, you just cite all the law that goes against the respondent. It has two benefits. One is the fact that you look very good, and two is when the respondent stands up, now they have to answer this. Unless they are a very good team who has prepared this kind of thing, they're going to struggle to stand up and say anything in response to this fantastic minute-long citation of law that you've just given them. I am mindful that people are beginning to lag a little bit. So, let's take a 5-minute break now and then come back to the rest of it. So. We left it with rebuttal and surrebuttal. I have been corrected to say don't take a phone because apparently in the rules there is a specific comment that you're not supposed to take electronic equipment up to the bench with you, up to the podium with you. Admittedly, or the table. Admittedly, as mentioned before, there is going to be at least one person in your team responsible for knowing the rules backwards and forwards. When it comes to rules about how you handle yourself as oralists, all of you should read those sections of the rules. Make sure you don't lose a round because of something stupid. The other teams do challenge, and I'll come to challenges right at the end. Rebuttal and surrebuttal. There are a number of ways that you can decide who's going to do rebuttal and who's going to do surrebuttal. With regards to rebuttal, there are 2 or 3 main ways of doing it. You either do it on the basis of who is your strongest speaker, because as much as you have 2 speakers, you have one maybe better than the other one. Alternatively, one that the judges liked more. If a judge just for some stupid reason takes a dislike to one of your 2 oralists, you can't help it. It might be because they didn't like the arguments, it might be because, I don't know, they have a problem with the color of your head. Something stupid. You don't want that person to necessarily be giving the rebuttal. So that's one way of selecting it. Who is going to have a better impression? Don't forget, after you sat down, it has been some 40-something minutes since anyone's seen you. From a judge's viewpoint, quite often we forget specifically who said what. So whoever does the rebuttal is the one who will leave the last impression of how good your team was as an applicant. The other way of doing it is on the issues. You can see that the respondent was weak on a point. They just made mistakes on it. Let's say the first respondent made mistakes. So you want to hammer home the mistakes that person made. Or that the judges had a problem with one of the arguments that the respondents made. And at that point, this is where the listening is, when you're at table, comes in handy. You've listened, you know the judges had a problem with a line of argument, so you would turn around and say, as Your Excellency noted, this person is an idiot because they said this. And you make the point in order to win. Sometimes you are selecting it not based on who your strongest person is, and not based on where the weak arguments of the other team is, but based on where the weak oralist of the other team is. If the other team has a strong first respondent and a weak second respondent, you might want to stand up and only rebut on the second respondent's points. That way, you will put them into a difficult position, because if the strong respondent stands up, now they have to rebut on their co-agent's points that they will never know as well as their own. And don't forget, the judges can ask questions, and they sometimes do ask questions. As soon as the questions come in, he's going to struggle. But the most standard way of doing a rebuttal is trying to split it so that you have questions for the first respondent and questions for the second respondent. So if you're rebutting on 2 points, you will make sure 1 point falls into this guy's territory, and this guy's territory, and 1 point falls into this guy's territory. Or ladies. Because that way, it doesn't matter which one stands up, they will have to now answer on at least the other person's point as well. That's where doing 3 comes in handy. Because if you really want to rebut on a weak point and a weak oralist, you still want to make sure that even if that weak oralist stands up, because they have to rebut on the 2 points which they did not do very well, they still have to also answer one of the other points of their co-agent. So wherever possible, you will always rebut covering both respondents' points. Does that make sense? It is quite a tactical battle when it comes to rebuttal. There are a lot of considerations, and unfortunately sometimes when you're sitting at the table you don't realize that the judges really hated one of your oralists. That's where your counsel comes in very handy, because the counsel is the only person who sat down and listened to both the oralists. So you might think you had a hard time because the judges grilled you, the other person thinks they had a fantastic time, that they must have liked me. And then counsel will say, no, actually, looking at it in terms of how you both got grilled, I'm pretty sure this guy was liked more by the judges. With respondents, I already mentioned, respondents respond. What I forgot to mention is, in their pleadings, respondents would do well to do the same thing of referring to the judges. So you refer to the applicant's position, the applicant said this, in response we say this. But also to what the judges said. Your Excellency asked about this. If you want to be, it's a dangerous territory because it can appear to be a smart ass. If you say, well, Your Excellency asked this question from the applicant, they didn't know the answer. To give you the answer now, because I am so much better than them, is this. It's fine to do if you're competing against a strong team, because that's potentially what's going to separate you. But don't be petty. If they say, Your Excellencies, at paragraph 26 of this case, it says this, you don't want to stand up and say, well, Your Excellencies, it's not actually paragraph 26, it's paragraph 24. I know it's so much better. It's irrelevant. Who cares? It's a 2-paragraph difference. If it doesn't make any difference, don't muddy the waters. When it comes to rebuttal, with rebuttal, you're rebutting the points the respondents made. You cannot introduce new points. You cannot suddenly say, by the way, I forgot this entire line of argument, so here it is now. It's just a response. Rebuttal the same. It's just a response to the rebuttal. You cannot turn around and say, the applicant in their main submission said something which I forgot to respond to. Here it is now. It is just a response to the rebuttal. A rebuttal is a survival. You're not trying to win. You're trying not to lose. Because the applicant has set the battle scene, you just have to say something. Doesn't matter if it's the best thing, so long as you make it look good, if you don't know the answer. Rebuttal is always difficult because you don't get any time to prepare for it. So usually what you have to do is, again, either send your strongest person up, which means if it is not on his points, the other person would have had to manually write down the answer for him. Or, quite often, you end up sending second respondent up. Why? Because when it comes to rebuttal, they would ordinarily rebut in the order. So if they haven't done it both on one person or the other person, if they have, then it's obvious. So far as possible, you will send the person who will know the issue up. If they're rebutted because they were smart on both people, you will send the second person up. Why? Because the first person would have had more time to write the answer. They would rebut in terms of first point, second point, third point, or first point, second point, third point. So that person would have had time to write it down. But again, I emphasize, rebuttal is just a point of not screwing up. That's it. You do often or sometimes get the killer blow when the rebuttal is so fantastic they just can't do anything about it. There's just nothing to say. You just have to stand up and say something. If they have rebutted on 3 points, you will find the points that you can easily rebut. That's why it's important to try to pick as few points as possible for rebuttal. If they have done 3 points and you know a very easy answer on 2 of them, you will answer those 2. And you will try to sneakily sit down without answering the third one necessarily. Either your time has hopefully run out before you got to this impossible point, or you just sneakily sit down. If the judge picks you up, you can say something. The alternative way of doing it is to say, for the remaining points, we refer your excellencies to our substantive submissions. It's fine to do that. There is an extreme idea that I have never seen done, but it is possible. The applicant can waive their right to rebuttal. They will stand up, go to the podium, your excellencies, the applicants waive its right to rebuttal. It's a dangerous thing to do because you are either struggling since you have nothing to say in response, or you're arrogant because the other team is so bad that you know you won it. So whilst you can do it, don't. Same with respondents. You can stand up. Of course, if the applicant has waived its right of rebuttal, there is nothing to rebut. There is one hypothetical scenario, and when I say hypothetical, it means it will never happen in practice. If the respondent has made a monumental error, that as soon as they sat down, they realized what kind of an error it was, you don't want to give them a chance to stand up and correct that error. It just doesn't happen. If the applicant waives right of rebuttal, there is nothing to rebut, so you don't stand up. If the applicant has rebutted, the respondent can still stand up, go to the podium and say, the respondent waived his right of rebuttal. Again, don't do it so far as possible. There was one other thing I was going to mention about rebuttal and rebuttal, which is currently lost on me. We'll come back to it if it comes back to me. Now, when it comes to your actual submissions, I mentioned that you get a cold bench and you get a hot bench. Before you even get there, you need to prepare. So, first off, we're going to take a few steps back. When the compromise is released around mid-September, I mentioned you should try to have your first draft of your written submissions by about mid-November. In the meanwhile, there are 2 schools of thought. One says, from pretty much day 1 or week 2, whatever it may be, as early as possible, you start having practice moots. Practice moots are essential. It's not always possible to have a full 90-minute practice moot where your applicants speak and then your respondents speak and then you rebut and you say rebut. Rebut and say rebut you usually leave for later. But even if it is just to have an issue, let's say first applicant with 20 odd minutes. You have 5 people on your team, one person stands up, the other 4 will grill him. It's fantastic fun, trust me. Just getting someone to have to answer you and refer to you so you are being abusive. You're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, this law is completely wrong. And they have to respond and say, we humbly disagree, Your Excellency. You think, you're still calling me Your Excellency even though I'm swearing at you. Brilliant. So, do practice moots. My view is you do practice moots from as soon as possible, because one of the best ways to find holes in your argument is having other people poke holes in it. It's easy to ask a question. It's difficult to answer a question. So as soon as someone even accidentally asks a really good question, you suddenly realize, oh dear God, there is a big problem with this line of argument, or this portion of it I don't know how to deal with. You will have the opportunity to go back and research it. The other way of doing it is to say, wait until the memorials are done and dusted, submitted in January, and then we have a month to practice. I don't think that's the best way of doing it. You might want to find a balance, maybe not within the first 2 weeks starting practice moots, but so far as possible, as early as you can. And then the frequency of it changes. So you can have fewer practice moots at the start because you need to spend more time researching. And then you can increase it. So within about 2 weeks, you'll have maybe 1 a week or 1 every 2 weeks practice sessions. Then, after your first draft is done, maybe by about mid to late November, you will have the opportunity to do 2 a week, up until, say, Decemberish, when you're trying to sit down and finalize your memorial. And that is the crucial bit of research you need to do. At that point, you might again ease off on the practice moots. So you have few to begin with, lots in the middle, few before your memorials are submitted, and then lots and lots and lots between the time your memorials are submitted and the actual rounds happen in sometime in February. Your national rounds, that is. It's, I think, the best way of doing it because it gives a balance of giving you time to research and giving other people a chance to both grill you in terms of finding holes in your arguments as well as practice. The more you speak, the more confident you become, the more you figure out what your problems are, what your little, and everyone has little speech tics. There was one of my co-agents who used to always say, "Indeed, Your Excellency. Indeed, Your Excellency." Every third word was "Indeed, Your Excellency." You will figure those out, and you will be able to cut them out early. So, that's the idea of the general preparation. You should, if possible, prepare a number of different scenarios. You want to prepare for a cold bench. A bench which will ask you maybe 2-3 questions at most. So you have to stand up and speak for 20 minutes without interruption. And you have to expand. This is a later stages. So maybe with a week or 2 before the actual rounds, you will do a cold moot, a cold bench, so that you are prepared in case something like that happens. You also want to prepare for a hot bench. Now, this can happen later on, or it can happen earlier, because a hot bench asks lots and lots and lots of questions. You want to see if you're able to deal with those questions. The advantage of a hot bench, if you do it earlier, is also because they're asking lots of questions, you will find out lots of holes in your arguments, potentially. So it'll help with which bits you need to research. The best moot that you should do earlier, not too early, but when you have a good idea of what your lines of argument are, is what we would refer to as an issue moot. It's the one that takes the longest. Instead of 90 minutes, it might take 3-4 hours. So you might not want to do it all in one sitting. You can always just do one person or one point. And the idea is no time limit. You will ask as many questions on every line of argument that the person is going to be running, including all the alternatives, including all the weak arguments, in order to figure out what your strong arguments are, what your weak arguments are, where the holes are, and how to fit it all together. And to come back to your question last week, it will also help figure out how to structure it. Which one should go first? Which one would naturally follow as the second argument? One of the earlier moves that you should also do is what is referred to as a sources moot. Sources of international law are very important in Jessup. You always want to know what your source is at any given time. It will give you an idea of knowing how to research and how to write as well. Because if you're relying on something, you want to be able to cite the specific source within 38.1. So every other question is, what's the source for that? Every submission you make, every legal argument you make, what's your source for that? It will force you into a good habit of knowing what you're relying on. Those are your general basic ideas of how to do various types of practice moves. The other point of preparation is that when you are doing a practice, you can rely on the opposition memorials. You usually get them within 1 or 2 weeks of the actual national round. I don't know how it might work in Ukraine, but most countries give them to you in advance. If you have your opponent's memorials, you do 2 things. You dissect them. You can literally just tear them in half. This is your half, this is my half. A lot of times it happens, especially if you're time pressured. You read them, you analyze them, you find any good arguments that you've missed. You find any weak arguments that you can, for the lack of a better word, hammer them on. This will help improve what you're going to be saying in your rounds. If you have good arguments, you now need to implement them within your own structure. You need to research them. But equally, you can use those memorials for practice sessions. So before you have ever actually turned up in the competition, if you have another team's applicant memorials, you will do your respondent submissions in response to the applicants that you have. You've effectively done a practice run of what's going to happen in real life. Using opponent memorials is fantastic because it will improve your arguments. All the way through, as you're doing these practice moots, write down the questions. Any question that is being asked, no matter how stupid, especially at the start, write them down. Find the answers to those questions. Again, if there are a handful of ways you can possibly increase your chances of winning, is 1, by having good quality research, and 2, by making sure that you don't not know the answer twice to the same question. If the questions come up once, make sure the next time it comes up, you know the answer. The number of questions is not infinite. You might not catch everything, but if you have prepared for the question as the judge is asking it, you can be confident that I've done this. I have got the perfect answer for this question. So, as you are doing various practice moves, write down the questions that are asked. Now, I mentioned that you can sit down with your teammates and they ask you questions. If possible, find other people to practice with you. Faculties can often be difficult. To get your professor of international law or whoever it may be to do a practice move with you might not always be easy. Possibly even tougher if you don't have that many people who can speak English fluently. As much as a practice move with an international law professor is possibly one of the best things you can have, not just because he will prepare you for your competition, but also because it will put you in good standing with that professor who will suddenly realize how much you actually know. But it doesn't have to be a professor of international law. It can be anyone. Anyone who is a lawyer preferably, or a law tutor, will have the basic ability of analytically dissecting something and asking relevant questions. Even if they're asking irrelevant questions, that's still good practice, because dealing with stupid questions is so important. You will get a lot of judges asking stupid questions. You need to be prepared for every type of question. And on a similar vein, expect the obvious questions. If you haven't realized it already, something like, what are the sources of international law? Is an easy question that you will always get at some point. What is custom? What are the sources of custom? What are the components of custom? These are the obvious questions. Expect the obvious questions, and of course, having a written answer, a 2-line answer of what is custom that you can perfect, is the course of action to take. So figure out what the kind of the stupid obvious questions are. When a round happens, the judges don't know how good you might be, or how bad you might be, or how much research you might have done. So they always try to gauge you by asking you the simple questions. Once you deal with the simple questions fantastically well, they think, I've got a team that I can now push. And then they'll start asking you the difficult questions. So, make sure you know the answers. However, when it comes to it, so long as it's not the most basic question, you also don't want to show how much preparation has gone into it and how much of it is your pure intelligence. So if you practice the question of, let's say, what is your view on the extraterritorial applicability of Article 2 of ICCPR? Now, for someone who has looked at the issue, that is probably a simple question. It would have probably come up, if that is your compromise about Article 2 of ICCPR, it would have definitely come up in your practice rounds. Time and time again. You know the answer. Because someone has asked it, you've written down the question, you've gone back, researched it, you've even written the model answer for this question. You don't want to turn around and just go, before the judge has even had a chance to finish his question, because I know it, because I've practiced it. No, you want to appear smart. So when the judge asks the question, kind of pause, think a little, and then you come back with a perfect answer. That way it almost looks like you just came up with this on the spot. It's little things like that that will help you. Any questions so far? Everyone understands everything. Perfect. Legal authority and facts. So this is now talking about the actual substantive points that you're saying. So you have done your preparation, you've done your practices, you have your structure, you know how to answer questions. In terms of the substantive point of what you say, as I mentioned earlier, you are being gauged on your knowledge of facts and law. The best way to demonstrate how good you are with your knowledge of facts and your knowledge of law is to show off with how much you actually know. Not only should you know the relevant parts of your compromise by heart, because you've read it half a dozen times at least, but also your main arguments you should know the law by heart. You know X and Y case, or X piece of commentary at paragraph X talks about this issue. And you have already had to footnote it in your memorial. including the paragraph or the page reference. So the way to look smart is by giving the judge the exact reference of what you're citing. Always give your law first. When you come to answer a question, you start with, yes, Your Excellency. And then you give your law. Article 2 of ICCPR, or at paragraph 267 of Nicaragua, the court stated that blah. That's your law. And then you apply it to the facts at hand. And if necessary, you draw a conclusion from it. Usually you don't have that much time. But can anyone think of what that possibly reminds them of? You give your law, you apply it.
IRAC.
Thank you. You effectively apply the IRAC method in your oral submissions as well. But always give your law first. And if you want to be that little bit more impressive, give the specific reference. So it's not just the law says this. It's not even Nicaragua says this, or the judge in Nicaragua at paragraph 200 and whatever says this. That's the little kind of tricks, because everyone can do it. You've already had to know that it's Nicaragua. Remembering a specific paragraph reference which is in your footnote is not too difficult. That is how you can increase the potential number of points you can get on your knowledge of law. Knowledge of facts is more important, because whilst law is wide and far and big, your facts are limited. When you are referring to the facts, specify where. At paragraph 29 of the compromise says this. Paragraph 32 of it, you will only ever have to know half a dozen to maybe a dozen paragraph numbers of the compromise for your issue. So remember them. Again, it's an extra, given that you're preparing for some 4 to 6 months, this is an extra 2 hours of preparation in that entire timepiece. It's not a hell of a lot, but it will look so much more impressive. And you will always have that little bit of self-satisfaction as soon as you say paragraph 29 of the compromise, you will see at least 2 of the 3 judges go, shh. It looks good. And once the judges can see that you have actually referred to the correct piece, provided you have referred to the correct piece, you will get those extra brownie points. Now, there is one thing I have so far avoided talking about, because this is technically the last piece of perfection when it comes to oral submissions. But also, actually no, before I come to that, apologies. Know your weak arguments and know your strong arguments. Don't be afraid to concede on your weak arguments. Now, I originally come from an Australian method of Jessup, which is very much, we're gonna be arguing everything, we don't lose anything. So when it came to something like conceding on points, they agree that conceding is helpful sometimes, because that will avoid having to argue things that you cannot possibly win. But they always say, we don't concede, we accept. For anyone who has a good grasp of English, conceding is losing. Accepting is mutually coming to an agreement. It sounds a little bit better, but it's the same thing. Whether you concede, whether you accept, don't shy away from saying, Your Excellencies, we agree. This tantamounts to torture. However, and then you can move on to actually make the point you want to make. We mentioned this when it comes to your written submissions, that you don't make weak arguments. When it comes to oral submissions, you equally don't want to make weak arguments, unless it's very much your alternatives. So, in order to just move on with it, you accept or you concede. The judges love that because it will show an understanding of the material that you don't want to fight at this point because you know it's weak, as well as an acceptance of the weakness. So you are picking your battleground again. Now the piece I was going to mention is the ultimate joy, which is if you know your arguments, you will almost inevitably know the other side's arguments, which means you can preempt them. You can say things before they've said them. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes you have to say, well, of this 5-part test, I don't have time to go through establishing all 5 points of it, but I know for a fact that the respondents will argue on points 3 and 4, which are the weakest elements of my submission. So I'm only going to concentrate on elements 3 and 4. Equally, if it's a 5-part test that you have to satisfy only one of these 5, you can say, Your Excellencies, they're only going to be debating 3 and 4 because those are the weak ones, but I only need to establish 1, 2, or 5. I'm going to establish 1. But a great oralist will know his co-agent's arguments. You don't have to know them backwards and forwards. You just have to know them a little bit. We mentioned this yesterday, sometimes the judges don't care the fact that it's not your point. So they will ask you about it. You will turn around and say, Your Excellencies, this is my co-agent's argument. But as a brief response, here it is. My co-agent will then expand on this further. When you're the co-agent, when you stand up, you will first do your general introduction and then you say, Your Excellency asked about this, here is the full answer. Before you even start talking about your main piece, you will answer the judge's questions. The point that it comes incredibly handy to know your co-agent's arguments is actually not so much when you have to answer a random question that you have to give a one-line summary. That's the minimum necessity that even by osmosis it would have sunk into your brain having sat down through so many practice boots. So you would at least know something about what your co-agent's going to be saying. The piece that it comes very handy is of course rebuttal and surrebuttal, if you have to answer the judge's questions on a point that is not yours. And most importantly, and if this should happen, there are so many extra brownie points that you get that it would be difficult to lose a moot. If your co-agent doesn't have time to finish their arguments, you can't stand up and say, well, my co-agent ran out of time, so I will now address, Your Excellencies, on periphery 2, 3, and 4. As soon as you say that, every judge will just go, what? Good luck. And I'll ask you a few questions. If you can deal with those questions, you have pretty much won the moot, because you've demonstrated an understanding above and beyond what anyone would expect of you. So, it's handy. Of course, it's rarely going to come up. And it's difficult. Don't spend vast amount of time trying to realize what your co-agent's arguments are going to be before you ever know your own. This is the sort of the cherry on top of the cake. You need to have the cake first before you have the cherry on top. Any questions on how to deal with judges? Wow, everyone knows exactly what's happening. Your compromise for this practice move that you're doing this week is a mini moot. You have 2 issues. So your applicant 1 will be talking about issue 1, your applicant 2 will be talking about issue 2. And you have a fixed time. But get into the habit of doing the full introduction. Even if it means you're going to change it a little bit for the main thing, still get into the habit of standing up, I don't actually know what the term of reference for European Court of Human Rights judges might be. Is it Your Excellency? Anyone know? Honourable judges? I don't know. I hope one of you would have figured it out by now. Get into the habit of doing this whole piece. I don't think anyone will mind if everyone agrees that they're going to refer to it the same way as the Jessup piece would, because that's ultimately what you're preparing for. So it's fine to turn around and say something along the lines of, Your Excellencies, may it please the court. My name is blah, I will be appearing with blah. I'm going to be speaking for 10 minutes, my equation will be speaking for 10 minutes on these issues, and so on and so forth. I mentioned there is a little trick that applicant 1 can do that will make life a little easier. This best applies to applicant 1, but it does apply to everyone else. Memorize your first minute or 2 minutes of submission. You're not going to get any questions ordinarily on that first minute. So your introduction has to be memorized. You want to do it so many times that it's second nature. That doesn't matter how nervous you are, you will still stand up, and through the entire nerves, you can be half asleep, you can be jumping through the ceiling on Red Bull, but still you will be able to cite that piece with the correct tone, with the correct pace, no matter what. Practice it enough times and it will sink in. And I don't mean practice it 200 times. A dozen times of saying it back and forth in front of the mirror will sink it in. Of course, that means having to write it down. Now, I do have a brief guide that I wrote up. In addition to the stuff that White and Case has done and the Chinese have done, I've got my own stuff that I've written. Use whichever you wish. I, of course, think my stuff is the best by far, no doubt. But mine is kind of quite informal, but it covers the little tricks of the trade. It doesn't go through the basic stuff that we covered. It's a little bit more advanced than that. There are a lot of little tricks. The list is endless, but to give you a few examples. If you're getting a difficult question, it's fine to say something like, "Thank you, Your Excellency." Don't overdo it. I'm not a big fan of thank yous, but you can do it. It is fine to sometimes break that level of formality, because as we said, you're both trying to be formal in order to shut down the judge, but you're also trying to be delightful. So if the judge suddenly comes up with this inspirational moment, even if you have prepared the answer, the perfect answer for that question, because it's an obvious question, but as an ego boost to the judge, you can turn around and say, "That's an excellent question, Your Excellency." Well, I happen to know the answer, but still. But again, know the tone and the place to do it. Don't overdo it. If the question requires a number of answers, same with your structure. Structure is always good. Say, "Your Excellency, there are 3 points in response to your question. First, second, third." It makes the judges more reluctant to jump in halfway through as you're saying point 1 when they know you've got 3 points to make. Doesn't always stop them, but it makes them more reluctant. But it also gives your answer a brilliant structure. If you get 2 questions from the judges, and you will get this, one judge asks something, and the next one goes, on that point, I've also got a question, and asks it. Now you have to deal with 2 questions. Again, you structure, you flag it. In response to Your Excellency's question, this. In response to Madam President's question, this. Or right at the start, if you're going to answer them in reverse. If I may, I will answer Madam President's question first before moving on to Your Excellency's question. And then you answer it. By doing that, you're flagging that you're not dodging any of the questions, you're answering every single one of them. Even if you answer the first question and you pick Madam President's question because it was easier than His Excellency's who asked a really, really annoying question you just didn't want to answer. And after answering Madam President's question halfway through it, something else comes up. You may never get to answer that guy's question. So what? Unless he brings you back to it, it's not always possible. There are, as I say, so many different ways of doing these things. I'm just naming a few off the top of my head, listing my notes, that I can't even think what else there could be. Anyone can think of other points, shout them out. Otherwise, we'll talk about the final piece, which is time management. This is a tricky area. A lot of people are very, very anal when it comes to time management. So if you have failed to keep on top of your time management, they will deduct you points. Unfortunately, when it comes to a hot bench, you have little control over your time management. You'll always run over. You just don't manage to ever finish. If it's a cold bench, you might always run under. That one is in your control, and it's your fault if you finish too early. And again, same with Goldilocks, you don't want to finish too late, you don't want to finish too early. The ideal situation is as you're concluding, the stop sign comes up. Before I forget, I will make this point. Stop sign comes up, you will stop mid-sentence if necessary. If you're scratching your nose, you will stop mid-scratch your nose. Nothing happens after the stop sign comes up. The only thing that you can possibly do after the stop sign, it's not even a point of I'm just going to finish my sentence because I was about to finish it. No, you stop. You will either then say, unless I can assist your excellencies further, I will now pass over to my co-agent. Effectively, you finish submissions. If you had more things that you wanted to say, a one-line conclusion, your excellencies, may I be permitted to finish my conclusion, to finish my sentence, to summarize the remaining point in 30 seconds. Whatever you say, stick to it. If you say, I want to finish my sentence, don't spend the next 2 minutes talking. If you say, I want 30 seconds for a conclusion, don't start raising new issues. But once that stop sign comes up, you will stop, you will ask if you may be permitted to conclude, to continue, or to sit down, or whatever else it may be. Then you do exactly as instructed. The same way, if the judge is asking you questions, you never interrupt the judge. You don't jump halfway through his question saying, I know what you're going to say, so let's just save us both some time. Nothing. You'll wait for the judge to finish, you will politely smile and nod, and as painful as it might be, thinking, you dumb idiot, I was going to go there. Stop talking. This question doesn't require 15 sentences. It's a 3-word question. I want to kill you. But you carry on nodding and smiling until it finishes. And then you answer politely. So, I was about to say something. Time management. You don't always get a say in it, but try to stick to it as much as possible. Technically, time management is up to you. That's why the bailiff shows you the time cards. Bailiff also shows the judge the time cards. The judge is supposed to be aware of it. If I'm judging, I will make sure I move you on. And I will never deduct you for time management. But some judges do. The best way to deal with it is to flag to the judges that you want to move on. If you're applicant 1 and you are stuck somewhere around here for 10 minutes, what you want to say is something along the lines of, Your Excellencies, as time is short, or as my time is rapidly elapsing, with your permission, I will conclude the remaining submissions on the prayer for leave 1 and then move on to prayer for leave 2. You will try to bring this in usually when the 10-minute mark goes up. The judges may not be very amenable. They might say, no, I want to carry on asking you questions. Fine. At some point, a few minutes later, once their incessant and annoying questioning comes to an end, you will ask it again. Your Excellencies, With your permission. And at that point, you haven't even started this. If it's a 15-minute mark, you say, Your Excellency, with your permission, I will now move on to my second prayer for leave. They say, but you didn't finish your first prayer for leave. Says Your Excellency. In summary, the remaining points are blah and blah. If they start asking you questions, answer the question as briefly as you can, and you emphasize the point that you want to move on. If you have emphasized it and you've stated it 2, maybe 3 times that you understand your time is short and you want to move on, and the judge still doesn't let you, their fault. If they deduct you, which they may, sorry to say, that's just the judge being stupid. There's nothing you can do about that. So all you can do is, on probabilities, if a judge doesn't care about time management, like me, fine. You've got an easy saying. I will make sure that you move on to the bits that I want you to talk about. If you have a judge who cares a little bit, so long as you've emphasized the point that you understand about time management, that's it. You've satisfied those judges. But for the minority of judges who will deduct you, even though it's their fault, there's nothing you can do about that. So don't fret. But that's unfortunately the nature of the beast when it comes to judges. Sometimes they are not the best of people. I am going to have a quick look through my notes to see if there is anything else that we need to cover. Any questions? Go ahead.
Well, in outlining the difference between an oral argument and the written one, and we understand that written has certain structure, all that, I reckon all that. How do you make sure that that doesn't come across in the oral argument as just highlighting the main argument, like the topics, just copying the topics of the written argument to the oral argument? How do you differentiate and make sure that your oral argument is, oral, like speech in the form, basically?
Yeah. If I understand your question, there are sort of 2 different sides to it that I will answer. Number 1 is it's not a bad thing for your oral submissions to be similar to your written submissions, both in terms of structure and in terms of tone. With regards to the fact that in written format you are often far more formulaic, you stick to very formal language, don't worry. When you speak, especially in response to questions, your natural instinct is to become more conversational. So this is the point that I hope it has come across. When it comes to oral submissions, it's a conversation. Always have that in your mind. You're having a chat with the judge. It's supposed to be amicable, it's supposed to be enjoyable. You're just gonna have a talk. But the reason I say don't worry too much about it is, again, 2 reasons. 1, your oral submissions are not going to follow the same structure as your written submissions. You learn things, you improve things, and you change things. So quite often, your oral submissions are going to take a different structure, and you will also drop arguments because you're time limited. So as much as it might be a good argument, if it's not necessary, you're not going to make it in your oral submissions. You might have to, in your written format, if there is a 5-part test, you will argue every one of those 5 in your written submissions. Oral submissions, you will ever want to do 1 or 2 of them. So automatically you will have a distinction between your written submissions and your oral submissions. But also because of the judges. Vast majority will ask you questions, and as a result of those questions getting asked, you will automatically A, become more informal and conversational, and B, it will also ensure that your arguments are not I am about to read the next 5 lines from my speech and then the next 6 lines, and then it just doesn't happen because you're having a back and forth with the questions. So naturally, it will just happen. I know this is not the most amount of comfort you can possibly have that it will happen, don't worry about it. Once you've done a few practice rounds, you will see how it goes. And automatically you kind of realize that this is very different to how you thought it might plan out. Anything else? I can see that I missed one very, very minor point. I already mentioned don't read your submissions, but your rebuttals you can write in advance because you know what the respondents are going to say, you know what the weak points are, have rebuttals prepared in advance. One thing I forgot to mention is your opponents. Be nice to your opponents, especially if they are not as good as you. You might win the round, but you don't want to be the horrible bastards who decided to beat on the little guy. There will inevitably be situations where you're better than someone, and there will be situations where someone is better than you. You want the favor to be returned. So even if you're going to win the round, be nice. If they've said something silly, don't mock them for it. Always be courteous. Always be nice. The only time you have permission to be nasty, that is to say, pick on every stupid thing they've said and hammer home the point, is if it is a very good round where both of you are neck and neck and you want to distinguish yourself. Being aggressive will only ever win you a close moot if it is genuinely close. Sometimes even being aggressive might lose you those moots. But on average, that's the only time you have a right to be aggressive. In every instance, if a judge sees you and you're better than the other team and you're still being nasty about it, mocking them, you might win the round, but they will just deduct your points because no one likes a horrible human being who is just being mean to someone else for no good reason. I think that is about it for everything that I wanted to cover. It's a little bit different because it is meant to be how the interaction with the judges happen, and as you have noticed, a lot of it is already covered. But what I want everyone to do is read up on what your introductions and your formalities of speech are going to be, and prepare something to talk about for 2 minutes. Anything. It can be your hobby, it can be a book, it can be anything. The whole idea is to do the formalities and to stand up and speak for 2 minutes. I know, gotta do some work, you can't just sit in the back. I did say that you're gonna have to little by little actually do something, and you can't hide away in the back of the class. You can make it funny if you want, you can make it serious, you can talk about the latest episode of Game of Thrones for all I care. Anything, actually no, not Game of Thrones, I haven't caught up, so not Game of Thrones, but anything else other than Game of Thrones, you're entitled to speak about. Anything. All I want is a nice structure of your introduction. What you're going to talk about, and then talking about it, and then your conclusion. That's it. And try to fit it in within 2 minutes. And tomorrow, everyone gets to stand up, hopefully in front of the camera, and actually speak for 2 minutes. And everyone else can laugh at them. I kid, no. No one's gonna laugh too much. So, enjoy, have fun, good luck. No?